I've been driving trucks for 32 years, moving freight across this vast country through every season, every kind of weather, every lonely stretch of asphalt that connects one forgettable town to another. The road has been my companion, my confessor, my only constant in a life measured in miles rather than moments. I've seen sunrises that could make you believe in something greater and storms that reminded you how small you really are. I've crossed deserts where the heat makes the horizon dance like a living thing, and I've navigated mountain passes so treacherous that every turn felt like negotiating with fate itself. But in all those years, in all those millions of miles, nothing prepared me for what I would encounter on that particular stretch of highway, cutting through the old-growth forests of the Pacific Northwest. There's a difference between being alone and being watched, and somewhere along those routes through the dense Oregon wilderness, that difference became impossible to ignore. Something shifted in me during those recent trips, a primitive awareness I didn't know I still possessed, whispering that the shadows between those ancient trees held more than darkness. The first time I felt it, I dismissed the sensation as fatigue, the product of too many consecutive runs without proper rest. My mind playing tricks in the perpetual twilight that exists beneath that thick canopy. But the feeling returned, trip after trip, growing stronger each time I passed through that same corridor of wilderness, where the trees stand like cathedral columns, and the air itself seems centuries old. I'd catch myself checking the mirrors more frequently, scanning the tree line with an urgency I couldn't quite explain, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary on roads I'd driven 100 times before. Other truckers would mention weird feelings on the CB radio when we'd all gather at the truck stops, joking nervously about the Oregon forests and the strange energy that seemed to pulse through them when dusk approached. But their laughter always felt forced, hollow, like we were all trying to convince ourselves that what we sensed wasn't real. I started noticing patterns, the way certain stretches always felt colder, how my truck's performance would subtly change in specific locations, the peculiar behavior of animals near the roadside. An old-timer once told me that the road reveals things to those who spend enough time on it, truths that settled people never learn because they're too rooted in one place to see the boundaries where the ordinary world ends and something else begins. The woods up there aren't like forests elsewhere. They carry weight, history, a presence that presses against you even through steel and glass. These aren't the neat, managed forests you find near populated areas, but true wilderness where trees have stood for centuries and the undergrowth remains thick and impenetrable, hiding whatever chooses to remain hidden. Fog is common in those mountains, rolling in off the Pacific and settling into the valleys like something alive. But lately it seemed different, more purposeful, as if it knew exactly when and where to appear. I'd started timing my runs to avoid the worst of it, planning routes that would get me through that section during daylight hours, but schedules don't always cooperate, and freight moves when it moves. The CB chatter from other drivers became my lifeline. Through those passages, proof that I wasn't completely isolated out there, that civilization still existed somewhere beyond the wall of trees. But even that comfort was becoming unreliable. Stretches where static would take over or the radio would fall silent in ways that had nothing to do with dead zones or equipment failure. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 weeks ago, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. Haven't been able to sleep without seeing those eyes reflected in my headlights. I've debated staying silent, keeping this to myself like so many others probably have, letting it fade into just another unexplained moment on the endless road. But silence feels like betrayal now, like I'm protecting something that doesn't need protection, or hiding a truth that demands to be acknowledged, even if no one believes it. I don't expect you to understand. I'm not sure I understand it myself, but I need to tell someone what happened out there in the wilderness, what I saw standing at the edge of the world we think we know. This isn't a story about monsters or fairy tales or the kind of legends people tell to scare each other around campfires. This is about the moment when everything you thought was solid ground suddenly reveals itself to be thinner than you ever imagined, and you realize that the maps we draw leave out far more than they include. That night changed something fundamental in me, cracked open a door I didn't know existed, and now I can't pretend the world is as small and explained as we like to believe. The highway stretched ahead into gathering darkness, that particular quality of dusk that transforms familiar landscapes into something uncertain and strange. I'd been making good time until the fog began rolling in, not gradually the way it usually does in these mountains, but suddenly, as if someone had opened a door and let it pour through. Within minutes, the visibility dropped to maybe 50 feet, then 30, the headlights reflecting back at me in a solid wall of grey that made the road feel like a tunnel carved through nothing. I eased off the accelerator, dropping from 60 to 40, then 30, my eyes straining to follow the yellow line that was my only guide through the blankness. The CB radio crackled with static, then went silent in a way that felt wrong. Not the natural fade of distance, but an abrupt cessation, as if every other driver had simultaneously stopped transmitting. I tapped the mic, called out to anyone who might be listening, but received only hollow emptiness in response. The woods pressed closer on both sides, the trees emerging from the fog like dark sentinels, and I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The forest had gone completely silent, no wind rustling. Through branches, no distant bird calls, nothing but the rumble of my engine and the hiss of tires on wet pavement. Even that seemed muffled, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere that had descended over this mountain pass. Then I saw the deer, 5 of them standing in the roadway perhaps 20 yards ahead, frozen in positions that defied natural behavior. They weren't startled by my approach, weren't running or even looking at the truck bearing down on them, but simply standing utterly motionless as if time had stopped for them alone. I hit the brakes, the air system hissing as the truck slowed, and as I came to a complete stop, I could see their eyes reflecting my headlights, wide and glassy, fixed on something beyond my line of sight. Their ears were pinned back, bodies rigid with a fear so profound it had paralyzed them completely, overriding every instinct to flee. I sat there with my foot on the brake, horn silent because something told me not to make unnecessary noise, waiting for them to move, to acknowledge my presence in some way. Minutes passed, or maybe only seconds that felt like minutes, before they suddenly bolted as one, breaking from their trance and vanishing into the fog with a crash of hooves on asphalt. But they didn't run away from my truck. They ran across the road, fleeing from something in the forest to my right, something I couldn't see. But that had clearly terrified them beyond reason. Above me, I heard the irregular beating of wings and looked up through the windshield to see birds flying erratically, their patterns chaotic and desperate, as if the very air had become hostile to them. I released the brake and continued forward, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to find another route. But there was nowhere to turn on this narrow mountain road with its steep embankments on either side. The fog seemed to thicken impossibly, reducing visibility to just beyond my hood, and I slowed to a crawl, leaning forward in my seat as if those extra inches might help me see through the grey wall. My dash camera was running, as always, that silent witness to countless miles of uneventful highway, its red recording light a small point of normalcy in the growing strangeness. I remember glancing at the screen showing the forward view, seeing the same limited visibility I was experiencing through the windshield, nothing unusual or alarming beyond the weather. But later, when I reviewed that footage, I would see what my conscious mind had missed in real time, a shadow moving between the trees, impossibly large and impossibly fast, pacing the truck from the forest edge. In the recording, you can see it for maybe 3 frames. A dark mass that moves with purpose and coordination, too tall to be a bear, too swift to be anything that should exist in those woods. The timestamp on the video would show those frames lasted perhaps a tenth of a second, but in that fraction of time, something crossed in front of several trees, covering ground that should have required many seconds at any natural speed. I didn't consciously see it then, focused as I was on the road and the oppressive fog. But something in my peripheral awareness registered the movement, sent alarm signals through my nervous system that manifested as a cold sweat breaking out across my back. A memory surfaced unbidden, something an old Native American man had told me months earlier at a truck stop about 40 miles back, words I'd filed away as local color. Interesting but not particularly relevant to my world of schedules and deliveries. He'd been sitting at the counter, nursing coffee that had gone cold, and when he heard me mention this particular route, he'd looked at me with eyes that seemed to hold considerable weight. "That's old land," he'd said quietly, not looking directly at me, but at something beyond the window, beyond the parking lot, toward the mountains in the distance. The Guardian walks there, when the boundary grows thin, when people forget the protocols, when the balance tips too far. Most people pass through and never know, never see, but some are chosen to witness, to remember, to carry the knowledge forward. I'd thanked him politely, left a larger tip than necessary, and thought little more about it until this moment, when his words returned with uncomfortable resonance. The boundary grows thin. What boundary? Between what and what? I hadn't thought to ask, assuming it was metaphorical, spiritual, the kind of wisdom that sounds profound but doesn't map to practical reality. Now, surrounded by fog and silence and the primal fear of animals, I wondered if I'd dismissed something I should have heeded, if there were truths about these mountains that couldn't be found in any trucker's guide or GPS system. The engine stuttered suddenly, a hiccup in the steady diesel rhythm that had been my constant companion for 23 years on the road, and simultaneously the headlights flickered, dimming to a sickly yellow before surging back to full brightness. I felt it through the steering wheel, through the seat, that wrongness that every driver knows instinctively, the mechanical equivalent of a heartbeat skipping. The dashboard lights wavered, gauges dipping and rising without correlation to any actual change in the truck's performance, and the GPS screen went dark before rebooting with a map that showed my location as somewhere in the middle of empty forest, miles from any road. I tapped it with my finger as if that might restore accuracy, but it continued showing impossible. Coordinates, the little blue dot representing my truck floating in blank green space. Through the windshield, I caught movement again, closer this time, a darkness moving against darkness that my eyes couldn't quite resolve into a definite shape, but that my deeper brain recognized as something living, something aware, something that was tracking my progress along this isolated stretch of highway. The dash camera swiveled slightly on its mount, responding to the truck's movement, and I found myself watching its screen more than the road ahead, as if that digital mediation might somehow make the situation more comprehensible, less immediately threatening. In the recording, I could see the fog, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, parting and closing, like curtains being manipulated by unseen hands. And there, just at the edge of the frame, that shadow again, keeping pace effortlessly despite my crawling speed. I realized with creeping certainty that I needed to stop, that continuing forward while the truck's electronics malfunctioned was dangerous in practical terms, but more than that, I felt an inexplicable compulsion to confront whatever was happening rather than pretending I could simply drive through it and emerge on the other side unchanged. The shoulder was narrow, barely wide enough for the truck, but I eased over carefully, feeling the right side tires sink slightly into softer ground and engaged the parking brake with a hiss of air pressure that sounded shockingly loud in the muffled silence. The engine idled roughly, missing beats, and I made the decision to shut it down completely, twisting the key and plunging myself into a quiet so profound it felt like a physical presence pressing against my eardrums. For a long moment I sat in the cab, hands still on the wheel, breathing carefully and listening to the absolute absence of normal forest sounds. No insects, no small animals rustling through undergrowth, nothing but my own respiration and the ticking of cooling metal. I told myself I was being irrational, that there were logical explanations for electrical problems and fog and frightened wildlife, that I was allowing isolation and exhaustion to transform ordinary events into something ominous. But even as I constructed these rational frameworks, I was reaching for the door handle, compelled by a need I couldn't fully articulate, to step outside, to place my feet on the ground, to face directly whatever presence I'd been sensing, rather than remaining sealed in the cab's illusory protection. The cold hit me first as I climbed down from the truck, not the clean chill of mountain evening, but something deeper and older. Air that felt like it was flowing up from underground caverns or down from altitudes where nothing lived. The fog enclosed me immediately, transforming the truck into a vague orange shape defined only by its running lights, the rest of the world reduced to grey, nothing extending in all directions without reference or boundary. I stood on the shoulder, gravel crunching under my boots, and felt the ancient forest surrounding me with a presence that went beyond the merely physical, as if the trees themselves were conscious and watching, as if the land had awareness and intention, and I had finally drawn its full attention. My breath should have been visible in the cold, but instead it seemed to vanish instantly, absorbed by the fog or by something in the fog, and I realized that even the moisture from my lungs was being taken into this place, becoming part of it. I walked slowly around to the front of the truck, ostensibly to check the engine, though I had no real intention of opening the hood, and as I moved I felt my perspective shifting, the driver's concern for his vehicle falling away to reveal something more primal, the awareness of prey in the presence of a predator, or perhaps not predator, but judge. Something that was evaluating me according to criteria I couldn't begin to understand. The silence pressed against my chest, and I realized it wasn't absence of sound, but rather a presence of something that displaced sound, that occupied the space where sound should be, and left no room for ordinary noise. I could feel my heart beating, could feel blood moving through my veins, could feel the electrical impulses firing in my nervous system, but couldn't hear any external confirmation of my existence, as if I'd stepped outside the normal flow of the world into some adjacent space where different rules applied. And then, cutting through that impossible quiet, I heard breathing, not my own, but something massive and deliberate, each inhalation and exhalation resonating at a frequency I felt more than heard, a rhythm that seemed to sync with the earth itself. It came from the tree line, perhaps 20 yards away, but impossible to pinpoint exactly. In the disorienting fog, and with it came a smell, thick and organic, musk and earth and something else I had no reference for, ancient and wild and utterly foreign to my experience. I froze there beside my truck, every muscle locked, knowing with absolute certainty that I was no longer alone, that I was being observed by something that had every advantage, and that whatever happened next was entirely beyond my control or understanding. The breathing continued, steady and unhurried, and I realized it wasn't the rhythm of aggression or predation, but something else entirely, something closer to contemplation, as if whatever stood in those trees was considering me with the same intensity that I was trying to comprehend it. I remained motionless beside the truck, my hand still resting on the cold metal of the hood, and gradually became aware that my own breathing had synchronized with that deep resonance, that my chest was rising and falling in time with the presence I couldn't yet see. It wasn't a conscious choice, but rather an instinctive response, the way animals mirror each other's postures when establishing communication. And with that synchronization came an unexpected sense of connection, as if the barrier between us was thinning, becoming permeable. The fog shifted slightly, parting for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of movement between the massive trunks. A shape too tall to be natural, too deliberate in its stillness to be anything but aware. My fear didn't diminish exactly, but it transformed into something more complex, laced with curiosity and a strange sense of recognition, as if some deep part of my consciousness remembered this encounter, even though I'd never experienced anything like it. The smell intensified, filling my lungs with each breath, and rather than repelling me, it began to seem almost familiar, carrying notes of cedar and rain-soaked earth, and the particular scent of wilderness that exists only in places humans rarely touch. I don't know what possessed me to speak, but I heard my own voice emerging into that smothering silence, rough and uncertain, saying simply, "I see you." Words that felt inadequate even as I spoke them, but that seemed necessary, an acknowledgement of presence and awareness. The breathing paused for several heartbeats, and in that suspension I felt the weight of attention focusing on me with absolute totality, not threatening but complete, the way a vast intelligence might notice a small, unexpected thing that had suddenly revealed itself as more than previously assumed. Then came a response, not words, but a sound that resonated through my entire body, low and complex, carrying layers of meaning I couldn't translate, but somehow understood at a level below language, a communication that bypassed my conscious mind entirely. It spoke of loneliness, I knew that somehow, of watching from the margins as the world changed and contracted, of territory that had once stretched endless and now existed only in these shrinking pockets of ancient forest. I felt tears on my face without realizing I'd begun crying, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of emotion that wasn't entirely mine, grief and endurance, and a profound weariness that came from centuries of witnessing. The creature was sharing something with me, I understood that, choosing to bridge the gap between our kinds, and in that moment I felt humbled and honored and terrified by the responsibility of being seen in return. The Givian fog swirled more deliberately now, and I recognized it as part of the creature's presence, not concealment, but rather a medium through which it could move between the visible and invisible, the known and the hidden. I took a tentative step away from the truck, not toward the tree line, but simply into the open, offering myself as visible and vulnerable, and felt rather than heard approval in the quality of the silence that followed. My hand rose without conscious decision, palm outward, the universal gesture of peace or greeting or surrender, and I held it there even as my arm trembled with cold and adrenaline. The breathing came closer, I could tell by the way it filled the space around me, and I caught another glimpse of movement, a massive form shifting between trees with impossible grace for something so large, deliberate and careful, navigating the forest with the ease of absolute familiarity. I understood then that this was its cathedral, these ancient trees and fog-shrouded mountains, that I was the interloper being granted temporary audience, and that the creature was allowing me to perceive it as an act of communication rather than revelation. Something passed between us in those suspended moments, not words or thoughts, but understanding, a recognition of mutual existence, of sharing this planet despite inhabiting completely different worlds, and I felt the weight of that acknowledgement settling into my bones, where it would remain long after this encounter ended. The creature stepped partially into view, still obscured by fog and shadow, but clear enough that I could perceive its general form, towering and powerful and utterly unlike anything catalogued or known. And in that partial revelation, I saw something that shook me more than fear ever could. In the set of those massive shoulders, in the angle of that enormous head, I recognized exhaustion, the weariness of being the last, of carrying knowledge and memory that had no one left to receive it. My throat tightened with emotion I couldn't name, grief for something I'd never known existed. And I whispered, "I'll remember," a promise I barely understood, but knew with certainty I would keep. The breathing softened, became almost gentle, and I felt a shift in the atmosphere, a subtle warming, as if the creature had accepted my words and found them sufficient. For a handful of heartbeats, we existed in that shared space, human and ancient. Sentinel, separated by evolution and experience, but connected by this singular moment of recognition. Then the presence began to withdraw, not retreating exactly, but rather fading back into the depth of the forest, and I understood that our exchange was complete, that I'd been given what the creature intended to share, and that asking for more would violate something sacred. The fog began to thin, natural air returning, and I stood alone beside my truck, changed in ways I couldn't yet articulate, marked by an encounter that existed outside normal human experience. The withdrawal felt gradual at first, a gentle recession like tide pulling back from shore, but then something shifted in the quality of the darkness, and I realized the creature hadn't retreated at all, but had simply moved to a different position, circling perhaps, or repositing itself with purpose I couldn't yet comprehend. The breathing I'd grown almost accustomed to suddenly changed rhythm, becoming faster and shallower, and the musk that had seemed almost comforting moments before intensified into something sharper, more primal, carrying an edge of what I could only interpret as agitation or alarm. My hand, still raised in that gesture of peace, began to tremble, not just from cold, but from a renewed spike of fear, as I realized that whatever understanding we'd reached might be fragmenting, that I'd misread something crucial in our exchange. The fog thickened again, but differently now, moving in aggressive swirls rather than the contemplative drifting of before, and I heard for the first time since arriving in this clearing the sound of other movement in the forest, distant but unmistakable, branches snapping with the rhythm of approach. The creature's breathing became a low growl, resonating through my chest cavity with such force that I felt my ribs vibrate, and I understood with terrible clarity that the sentinel wasn't agitated with me, but rather responding to something else, some threat or intrusion I couldn't yet perceive. My promise to remember suddenly felt inadequate, childish even, as I realized I'd stumbled into something far more complex than a simple encounter, that I'd arrived during a moment of significance I didn't have the context to understand. The trees to my left exploded with motion and sound as something massive crashed through the undergrowth, and I caught a glimpse of another shape, smaller than the sentinel, but still enormous, moving with the frantic energy of panic or pursuit. The creature I'd been communing with released a sound I felt more than heard, a subsonic roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet, and I watched in stunned disbelief as it moved fully into the clearing, no longer concealing itself, stepping between me and whatever approached with unmistakable protective intent. In the fractured light of my still flickering headlights, I saw it clearly for the first time, towering at least 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, shoulders broader than any human's could be, arms that hung to its knees, with hands large enough to encompass my entire head. But it was the face that arrested me completely, weathered and somehow ancient, with eyes that caught the headlights and threw back an amber reflection full of intelligence and concern, and something that looked heartbreakingly like fear, not for itself but for me, for the fragile human caught in the middle of something I couldn't comprehend. The smaller creature burst into the clearing, and I saw it was younger, less controlled, its movements jerky with distress, and the sentinel moved toward it with shocking speed, placing itself fully between us, arms spread wide, in a gesture I recognized instinctively as protection. The young one called out, a haunting vocalization that sounded almost like words, almost like pleading, and the sentinel responded with that deep, resonant voice, and I stood frozen as I witnessed what I could only describe as a family in crisis, a parent trying to calm a child while also shielding both of them from the unpredictable danger of my presence. My chest tightened with the sudden weight of understanding what my intrusion actually meant, how my simple decision to pull over and investigate had inserted me into their world during what was clearly a vulnerable moment, perhaps a migration or teaching or some other ancient practice I had no right to witness. The young one tried to move around the sentinel, driven by what looked like curiosity or perhaps confusion about what I was, and the larger creature gently but firmly redirected it, making sounds that were unmistakably parental, authoritative but tender, and I felt tears streaming down my face again as I watched this being I'd been taught didn't exist, protecting its offspring with the same instincts that drove any parent, human or otherwise. The sentinel glanced back at me, and in that brief meeting of eyes, I saw exhaustion compounded by new worry, the burden of being seen not just by me, but potentially exposing its young to whatever consequences my knowledge might bring. I understood in that moment the full weight of what my promise to remember actually meant. That I was being trusted with knowledge that could endanger them, that the creature had revealed itself not out of desire, but perhaps necessity, and that my response to this revelation would determine whether I was worthy of the gift or merely another threat to their survival. The protective stance hadn't wavered. The young one settled slightly under the sentinel's guidance, its breathing slowing, but its eyes never leaving me, wide with that mixture of fear and fascination that transcended species, and I realized I was seeing something anthropologists and cryptozoologists had theorized about for decades, but never confirmed, evidence of their social structure, their family bonds, their capacity for nurturing and education. The sentinel's protective stance began to relax incrementally, though its attention remained divided between me and its offspring, and I noticed for the first time the subtle variations in their appearance, how the younger creature's hair was lighter in color, its features less defined, still growing into the massive frame that would eventually match its parents' impressive stature. Behind them, partially obscured by fog and shadow, I detected movement that suggested there might be others, more members of whatever family or group unit they belonged to, watching from the safety of deeper forest, trusting the sentinel to assess and manage the threat I represented. The realization crashed over me with profound humility that I wasn't witnessing an isolated creature, a lone monster from campfire stories, but rather catching a glimpse of an entire hidden society that had learned to exist in the margins of human expansion, adapting and surviving through intelligence and intentional concealment. The dash camera continued its quiet recording from inside the truck cab, capturing what I knew would be either the most significant footage in cryptozoological history or simply more grainy, inconclusive images that skeptics would dismiss as hoax or misidentification. But standing in that moment, I found I didn't care about proof or validation or being believed. The sentinel made a sound, lower and more rhythmic than before, almost musical in its cadence, and the young one responded with similar vocalizations, and I was witnessing language, actual communication with structure and meaning, parents teaching their child the sounds and patterns that carried their culture forward through generations of hiding. Tears continued streaming down my face as the full scope of what humanity had lost through our arrogance became clear. Not just the knowledge of these beings' existence, but the possibility of coexistence, of learning from species that had mastered the art of living within nature rather than dominating it, of understanding intelligence that took forms we'd never thought to recognize. The sentinel turned its full attention to me again, and this time its expression held something different, not just wariness or concern, but what looked almost like disappointment, as if it could perceive my emotional revelation, but also understood the futility of it, knowing that whatever enlightenment I'd experienced would die with me, unable to be translated into words that would convince my own kind. I thought of the Native American attendant who'd warned me years ago about the guardian of these forests, how his words had carried weight I'd dismissed as superstition, and I understood now that his people had known all along, had maintained awareness and respect through generations, while my culture had relegated these beings to myth and legend, mockery and denial. The young one made a chirping sound, almost playful, and tried again to move toward me, its curiosity apparently overriding its fear, and I saw the sentinel's shoulders sag slightly with what I recognized as the universal exhaustion of parenthood, that moment when vigilance wars with the desire to let your child explore and learn. Without thinking, I slowly crouched down, making myself smaller and less threatening, and addressed them both with quiet words I knew they wouldn't understand linguistically, but hoped they might grasp. Emotionally, I'm sorry we made you hide. Sorry we made you fear us. Sorry we forgot how to share this world. The young one tilted its head at the sound of my voice, mimicking the gesture I'd seen in young children encountering something new, and the sentinel watched this interaction with visible tension, ready to intervene but allowing the moment to unfold, perhaps recognizing that teaching its offspring about humans required actual exposure, carefully managed. The fog shifted again, and I heard the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle, another trucker following the same route I'd been traveling, and the spell shattered instantly as the sentinel registered the new threat, gathering its young with remarkable gentleness despite the urgency of their situation. Before retreating into the forest, the creature paused and looked directly into my truck's dash camera, as if understanding its purpose and making a deliberate choice to be recorded, to leave evidence that could be interpreted as either gift or challenge to humanity. In that final frame before they vanished into the darkness, I saw the young one raise one massive hand in what looked impossibly like a wave, a gesture of goodbye, or perhaps acknowledgement that we'd shared something significant. And then they were gone, the forest swallowing them so completely it was as if they'd never existed at all. The approaching headlights grew brighter, and I stood alone on the roadside, covered in sweat despite the cold, trying to reconcile what I'd witnessed with the reality I'd have to return to, knowing that the other driver would see only an empty highway and a colleague who'd pulled over for reasons he could never adequately explain. The other truck's headlights swept past my position and continued down the highway, the driver never slowing, never seeing me standing there in the dissipating fog, and I realized with crystalline clarity that I was now the keeper of a secret that would isolate me from my own species as surely as these creatures had been isolated for centuries. I climbed back into my cab with trembling hands and immediately reached for the dash camera, my fingers hovering over the playback button, suddenly terrified of what I might or might not see, captured in its digital memory, understanding that confirmation would burden me with impossible responsibility, while absence of evidence would leave me questioning my own sanity. The driver's seat felt different somehow, as if I'd returned to familiar surroundings as a fundamentally changed person, and I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, barely recognizing the face staring back at me with its expression of stunned wonder and profound grief. My radio crackled back to life with startling suddenness. Another driver's voice complaining about road conditions and delivery schedules, the mundane concerns of my profession sounding alien and trivial after what I'd witnessed. And I couldn't bring myself to respond, couldn't pretend that anything about the world remained normal or comprehensible. The young one's face lingered in my mind with heartbreaking clarity, its innocent curiosity and complete vulnerability, and I understood with sickening certainty that sharing my footage could endanger not just that juvenile but their entire hidden community, bringing hunters and researchers and curiosity seekers flooding into these mountains with intentions ranging from scientific to sinister. My hand moved to the camera's delete function, hovering there while my conscience waged war between my duty to truth and my unexpected role as protector of beings I'd encountered less than an hour ago, creatures that had shown me more genuine emotion and intelligence than I'd witnessed in years of human interaction on these lonely roads. The weight of this decision pressed down on me with physical force, making it difficult to breathe, and I realized this was the test the sentinel had been administering when it looked directly at the camera, offering me the choice between revelation and protection, between fame and responsibility, trusting me in that moment to choose correctly. Despite having every reason to doubt human judgment, I thought of the Native American attendant's warnings, how his people had maintained protective silence for generations, accepting the mockery and dismissal of outsiders rather than expose these beings to danger, and I finally understood the loneliness of that burden, the isolation that comes from knowing truths you can never safely share. The camera's tiny screen glowed in the darkness of my cab, waiting for my decision, and I imagined the trajectory of events if I released this footage, how quickly academic interest would turn to exploitation, how the sanctuary of these ancient forests would be violated by human intrusion, how that young one's curious nature might lead it toward people with less benevolent intentions than my own. My years on the road had taught me about human nature in its rawest forms, the truck stops and rest areas where people revealed their true characters away from civilizing influences, and I knew with absolute certainty that we as a species had not earned the privilege of this knowledge, had not demonstrated the wisdom or restraint necessary to coexist with beings who'd survived by remaining hidden. Tears returned to my eyes as I accepted what I had to do, understanding that this decision would haunt me for whatever years remained in my life, leaving me forever unable to prove the most significant experience I'd ever had, marking me as the keeper of an impossible secret that would die with me unless I found others who'd been similarly chosen and tested by these ancient guardians of the boundary between worlds. My finger moved to the delete button but stopped at the last moment, and instead I removed the memory card and tucked it into my jacket's inner pocket, unable to destroy the evidence completely, but committing to keep it private, a personal record of the night. Everything changed. The engine started smoothly now, all mechanical problems mysteriously resolved, as if the malfunction had been intentional, a method of ensuring I would stop in precisely the right location, at the exact moment when the Sentinel needed to assess whether humanity had evolved enough to be trusted with knowledge of their existence. I pulled back onto the empty highway with my precious cargo of secret memory, my truck feeling heavier somehow despite carrying the same load I'd started with, and I understood that weight was the burden of witnessed truth, the heaviness of responsibility for protecting the vulnerable, regardless of personal cost. Through my cracked windshield, I watched the forest slide past, now knowing what lived in those shadows, what eyes might be watching my passage, what society existed just beyond the range of human perception, and I whispered a promise into the darkness that I would honor what they'd shown me by maintaining the silence their survival depended upon. The miles accumulated beneath my wheels, as they had for decades, but everything felt different now, charged with meaning and possibility, and I began composing the story I would tell myself in the lonely hours ahead, the version that acknowledged what I'd experienced while changing enough details to protect the specific location and circumstances. I would research the disappearances and sightings as I'd originally intended, but now with the purpose of identifying others who'd been chosen for similar encounters, who carried the same burden of knowledge and silence, who might become part of a quiet network of protectors rather than exploiters of these magnificent beings. The young one's face remained vivid in my memory, its expression of innocent wonder, untainted by the fear and hatred that characterized so much of human interaction with the unknown, and I understood that I'd been given a gift beyond measure, a glimpse of what we might have become if our species had chosen coexistence over dominance, harmony over conquest. My hands steadied on the wheel as purpose crystallized within me, a new mission emerging from the shock and confusion of the encounter, and I knew that my remaining years on these roads would be spent as a silent guardian myself, watching and protecting from a distance, ensuring that the boundaries between worlds remained intact until humanity finally evolved enough to deserve what waited on the other side. The creature's hand remained pressed against my truck for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, and in that suspended moment between impact and retreat, our eyes locked with an intensity that dissolved every barrier I'd constructed between myself and the raw truth of existence. What flooded into me wasn't communication in any linguistic sense, but something far more primal and complete. Emotions transferred directly from consciousness to consciousness without the inadequate filter of language. And the first wave that hit me was grief so profound it drove the air from my lungs and brought fresh tears streaming down my face. This being had watched its world shrink year by year, decade by decade, century by century, the forests that had once stretched endlessly now fragmented and diminished, carved into parcels and penetrated by roads like the one I traveled, each human incursion pushing its kind further into isolation and scarcity. I felt the loss of companions, of territory, of the simple ability to exist without fear. And beneath that grief flowed an undercurrent of bewildered pain at being forgotten by a world that once acknowledged its presence through respect and careful distance rather than denial and encroachment. The second wave brought loneliness so absolute it made my own decades of solitary driving seem like crowded fellowship by comparison, and I understood that this creature might be among the last of its kind, wandering these mountains in search of others like itself, finding only silence and emptiness where once there had been community and connection. I saw flashes of memory that weren't mine, moonlit gatherings in hidden valleys, the comfort of being understood without words, the simple peace of existing among your own kind without explanation or justification, and felt the aching void left by the absence of those experiences, the soul-crushing isolation of being perhaps the final witness to your own species' existence. This sentinel had been watching humans for longer than my family had existed, observing us spread and multiply and consume with the patient horror of something that recognized the pattern and understood its inevitable conclusion. And the loneliness came not just from physical isolation, but from bearing witness to destruction that no one else seemed to notice or care about. My heart physically hurt in my chest, sympathetic pain radiating from an organ struggling to process emotions it wasn't designed to contain, and I realized I was sobbing openly now, crying for this being and for everything we'd collectively destroyed. In our thoughtless expansion across landscapes that had never been ours alone, the third wave arrived with unexpected force, a surge of rage that made the truck's interior feel too small, too fragile, and I understood this wasn't mindless animal fury, but the focused anger of intelligence confronting injustice. It lacked the power to prevent or correct. This creature knew exactly what was happening to its world and could articulate that understanding in ways that transcended my limited human consciousness. And the rage came from awareness combined with helplessness, from watching the irreplaceable be replaced with the mundane, from witnessing wonder traded for convenience without anyone pausing to consider what was being lost. I felt its fury at being dismissed as myth or monster, rather than recognized as fellow inhabitant of this planet with equal right to existence, at having its home treated as empty wilderness available for human exploitation, at watching the young one grow up in a world that offered less safety and less future with each passing season. The anger wasn't directed at me personally, but at what I represented, the species that had claimed everything without asking permission or acknowledging cost. And I absorbed that rage without flinching, because I knew with complete certainty that it was deserved, that we had earned every ounce of this being's fury through generations of careless dominion. But underneath the grief and loneliness and rage, deeper than all those powerful emotions, I detected something that broke me completely, a fragile thread of desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, There existed humans capable of seeing and understanding and choosing differently. The creature had shown itself deliberately, had made this encounter happen, not as attack but as test and plea, offering one more chance for connection across the species boundary, despite having every reason to abandon hope in human capacity for wisdom or compassion. In that moment, I felt the full weight of responsibility settle onto my shoulders, understanding that I'd been chosen not randomly but specifically, assessed and deemed potentially worthy of carrying this knowledge forward. And the creature's eyes held mine with an expression that was indeed pleading, as the camera had captured, asking without words if I would be the one who finally understood, who finally chose protection over exploitation, who finally demonstrated that humanity might deserve to share this world after all. The hand lifted from my truck with surprising gentleness, and as the creature turned back toward the forest, I felt the connection between us stretch but not break. A permanent thread now linking my consciousness to this ancient being's fate, making me responsible in ways I was only beginning to comprehend for ensuring that this wouldn't be our final communication, that the boundary between worlds might someday thin enough for genuine coexistence rather than tragic isolation. The creature vanished into the darkness between the ancient trees, and I sat trembling in my cab with the engine ticking its cooling rhythm and my own heartbeat gradually slowing from its panicked gallop to something approaching normal, though I knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be truly normal again after what had just occurred. My hands shook as I reached for the dash camera controls, fingers fumbling with buttons I'd operated thousands of times before, and I rewound the footage with a mixture of desperate need to confirm what had happened, and equally desperate hope that maybe the camera had captured nothing, that I could dismiss this as stress-induced hallucination and return to the comfortable ignorance that had carried me through 5 decades of life. But the footage was there, undeniable and, well, clear despite the fog, showing the massive figure emerging from the tree line with deliberate purpose, showing the moment of impact when the windshield spiderwebbed under impossible force, showing the creature's face in heartbreaking detail as it stared directly into the camera with those eyes that held centuries of accumulated wisdom and sorrow. I watched the sequence 3 times, then 5, then lost count as I searched each frame for understanding, and it was on perhaps the 10th viewing that I noticed what I'd missed in the chaos of real-time experience. In the final frames before the creature retreated, its expression shifted from rage and grief to something softer, and its free hand moved in what could only be described as a gesture, palm raised and fingers spread in a configuration that human cultures across the world would recognize as blessing or farewell. I sat with that realization as the fog began to thin and the first stars appeared through breaks in the clouds overhead, understanding that I'd been given something precious and terrible, a responsibility that would reshape the remainder of my life, whether I wanted it or not. The veteran trucker who had pulled over at this spot no longer existed. He'd been someone who drove through wilderness without truly seeing it, who treated these forests as mere obstacles between delivery points, who'd lived a life of comfortable disconnection from the deeper truths that pulsed beneath the surface of ordinary reality. The person I was now carried memories that weren't entirely his own, emotions that exceeded individual human capacity, and knowledge that demanded action, even though I had no clear understanding yet of what form that action should take. I thought about the truck stop attendant who'd warned me years ago about this stretch of road, whose words I'd dismissed as colorful local superstition, and realized he must have known something, must have carried his own experience, or inherited wisdom from those who'd encountered the guardian before me. How many others had received this terrible gift of seeing, and what had they done with the knowledge, and had any of them succeeded in making the difference that the creature so desperately needed someone to make? The questions multiplied in my mind like splitting cells, each one generating 3 more, and I understood that my remaining years would be spent pursuing answers that might not exist, trying to solve a problem that humanity had spent centuries creating and might lack the collective will to address. I started the engine with a hand that had finally stopped shaking and pulled back onto the empty highway, following the familiar route toward my delivery destination, while my mind traveled paths entirely new and unmapped. The CB radio crackled back to life with the usual chatter of drivers sharing road conditions and weather updates and complaints about dispatch, and I listened to their voices with a strange sense of distance, as if I were hearing transmissions from another planet rather than fellow travelers on the same roads. Everything looked different now, despite nothing physically changing. The trees that lined the highway were no longer mere scenery, but individuals with decades or centuries of accumulated experience. The darkness between them was no longer empty space, but habitat for mysteries that deserved protection rather than dismissal, and the wilderness I'd driven through countless times revealed itself as territory I'd never actually seen until this moment. I thought about what I would say if I tried to share what had happened, how my words would be received by people who lived comfortably within the boundaries of accepted reality, and I knew with sad certainty that the full truth would remain unspoken, translated into vague references to wildlife sightings or strange weather conditions, another story that would join the countless others told by those who'd glimpsed something beyond ordinary experience and found no adequate language to convey it. But silence wasn't the same as inaction, and as miles rolled beneath my tires, I began forming the outline of a plan that honored the trust the creature had placed in me through its deliberate revelation. I would research everything available about this region: historical accounts, indigenous traditions, patterns of sightings and encounters, environmental impact studies, development proposals that threatened remaining wilderness, and I would find ways to protect what needed protection, even if that meant working through channels that never acknowledged the true reason for my advocacy. The footage on my dash camera would remain private, shown only to those rare individuals whose eyes held the particular quality of openness that suggested they might understand, might join the quiet effort to preserve spaces where ancient things could still exist beyond human dominion. I would become a witness in the truest sense, someone who had seen and been forever changed by seeing, who carried forward the knowledge that we share this world with intelligences we've pushed to the brink of extinction, through our assumption that humanity's needs supersede all other considerations. The creature had asked if I would remember, and I answered that silent question now with a promise made to the darkness rushing past my windows. I would remember. I would speak truth in whatever ways remained available. I would ensure that this encounter wouldn't end with me, but would ripple forward into whatever future we might collectively create, and I would hold space in my heart for the possibility that the boundary between worlds might someday thin enough for genuine reconciliation rather than tragic farewell. I spent the following months transforming from a man who drove through the world into one who truly inhabited it, studying everything I could find about the wilderness corridor where my encounter had occurred, and discovering a history far richer and more complex than I'd ever imagined during my decades of passing through without really seeing. The research led me through archives of indigenous oral traditions that spoke of guardians who maintained balance between human and natural realms, through environmental reports documenting habitat fragmentation and species decline, through decades of scattered encounter reports from hunters and hikers and others who'd glimpsed something extraordinary and been forever changed by the glimpse. I found patterns in the sightings that suggested the creature moved along specific routes corresponding to ancient migration corridors, now bisected by highways and development, and I understood with deepening sorrow that what I'd witnessed wasn't merely an individual being, but perhaps one of the last representatives of something that had once thrived across these mountains before human expansion forced it into ever-shrinking refugees. The truck stop, where I'd once received a warning, became my regular stopping point, and I gradually earned the trust of the attendant who'd tried to prepare me years earlier, sharing coffee and careful conversation until he understood I'd become someone worthy of deeper knowledge, someone who'd been marked by genuine encounter rather than casual curiosity. He told me stories passed down through 7 generations about the old ones who walked the boundary times when fog rose thick and the barrier between visible and invisible worlds grew permeable, beings who'd once moved freely across the land before treaties were broken and wilderness was reduced to fragments too small to sustain their ancient patterns of existence. His grandfather had encountered one during a vision quest in these same mountains, receiving a message about humanity's choice between domination and coexistence, between treating the land as resource to be exploited or relative to be honored. And that message had been carried forward through the family with the understanding that eventually someone would need to speak it to the wider world that had forgotten how to listen. I realized the creature had chosen me, not randomly, but with precise intention, selecting a witness who traveled widely and might carry the story beyond local boundaries, whose profession placed him in contact with hundreds of other drivers who themselves traveled the continental network of highways that had carved the wilderness into isolated patches. The responsibility settled more heavily on my shoulders with this understanding, but it also brought clarity about what needed to be done and how I might accomplish it within the limitations of a world that dismissed such encounters as fantasy or delusion, rather than accepting the uncomfortable reality that we share existence with mysteries we've nearly destroyed. I began documenting other drivers' experiences during those long nights at truck stops and rest areas, listening for the particular quality in someone's voice that suggested they'd seen something beyond ordinary explanation and needed permission to speak about it without fear of ridicule. The stories emerged slowly at first, then with increasing frequency as word spread that I was someone who listened without judgment, and I collected accounts from across the continent that painted a picture both heartbreaking and strangely hopeful. The forests and mountains and deep wilderness areas still harbored ancient presences, damaged and diminished but surviving, waiting for humanity to evolve beyond its adolescent assumption that we alone possess consciousness and rights and value worthy of consideration. I created an anonymous online archive where people could share their encounters safely, and it grew into a community of witnesses who'd all experienced that same moment of devastating recognition when something old and aware looked back at them from the darkness and showed them how profoundly we'd failed in our relationship with the living world. We organized quietly around protection efforts, supporting conservation initiatives and opposing development projects that threatened remaining habitat, never speaking publicly about our true motivation, but working with steady determination toward preserving spaces where mystery could still exist beyond human control and exploitation. The years have passed, and my driving days are ending now, my body finally demanding the retirement that my spirit resisted because the roads had become sacred territory where I performed my witnessing work and honored the promise made during that fog-wrapped encounter that reshaped everything I understood about reality and purpose. I've trained younger drivers who carry the same quality of having seen and been changed by seeing, passing forward the responsibility of protection and remembrance to those who'll continue after I'm gone, ensuring the creature's plea wasn't answered by just one person's brief effort, but by a sustained movement that ripples forward through time. The dash camera footage remains stored in multiple secure locations with instructions for its release should certain environmental thresholds be crossed. a final testimony held in reserve should humanity need shocking into awareness of what we're losing with our endless appetite for development and resource extraction. I think about that moment of contact when centuries of grief and loneliness poured into my consciousness, and I understand now it wasn't just the creature's isolation I felt, but the accumulated sorrow of the natural world itself, the mourning of every species diminished, and every wild place destroyed by our assumption that we alone matter in the grand scheme of existence. The gift I received that night was terrible knowledge of what we've done and what we're still doing, but it was also an invitation to participate in something larger than individual human life, to join the ancient work of maintaining balance and honoring relationship, to remember that we belong to the earth rather than the earth belonging to us, and to carry that remembering forward into whatever uncertain future awaits those willing to walk the boundary between worlds and speak truth to those who've forgotten how to listen. What would you do if something ancient looked back at you from the darkness and asked to be remembered? Subscribe to hear more stories that remind us how much mystery still exists in the world we think we know.